You know, I never saw anything like this in college.
No. I know.
But that's CBD flower.
Wow.
So I can sell it in this volume. I see
Nice.
your smile. Right? Isn't that crazy?
Crazy.
There are people on all sides of the spectrum. There are still people who think that changing the laws around cannabis is opening up Pandora's box. There are people that still believe that cannabis is a, quote, gateway drug, and it's the reason we have an opioid epidemic, which is factually completely debunked. There have been advocates for reforming these laws for as long as I've been alive. I've been advocating for changes to these laws since 1994, when I first campaigned to serve in the House of Representatives in Vermont as a student at UVM. And so I've been outspoken about it since I then got elected in 96 as a policymaker for 23 years now. And at first I was, yelling about it. They're saying, we're managing this plant all wrong in our society. Some of these things are done in steps. In 2003, we passed a very conservative medical use bill. Then suddenly people came out of the sort of woodworks for that. And relatives or friends who thought, oh, this is something that very few people do, started learning that it was helpful for combating chemotherapy side effects. It was helpful for people who had HIV and AIDS with their diet and appetite. It was helping them be healthier again. When we ultimately expanded the medical law and then decriminalized cannabis for all kinds of important reasons related to criminal justice reform, that's another side that has been getting more and more momentum is, what are our criminal laws like and why and who is more adversely affected and how is racism involved in that, which is a huge piece of cannabis laws. Actually, Richard Nixon in the early 70s commissioned a study to look at changing how cannabis was regulated at the FDA. And it was unanimous that it should not be a Schedule I drug. He actually doubled down and created the war on drugs because it was his main tool for suppressing the civil rights movement and the anti-war movements. And so there's all this interwoven history that includes a huge swath of racism. And as we're starting to really examine our criminal justice system and how it disproportionately affects communities of color, that's also opening up doors to changing this laws. And over many, many years, through debunking the myths and propaganda that's been over this plant for 85 years, more people that knew that that was myth and propaganda felt more and more comfortable coming out and speaking about it. And as people started to see that there were positives to this plant, it slowly peeled away the layers of propaganda. So there's a lot of different pieces to this wave and ripple effect. A plant like this has actually 400 different cannabinoids. Some are tetracannabinoids, which is the THC, and others are not, which is the CBD. There's unlimited licenses out there for larger scale, whether it's 500 plants, 5,000 plants. Some people are doing 90 acres, some are doing 70, 80, 90,000 plants. Those are CBD varieties. They're not going to get anybody euphoric and high and whatever the way adult use cannabis will. Actually, under state law, we allowed for the growth of, quote, industrial hemp. It's got to be 7 to 10 years ago. I was still in the House. And then a few years later, in the Senate, we removed the word industrial, because there really wasn't a need for the word industrial. I think at the time it was at first put in to further distinguish cannabis grown as hemp versus cannabis grown for recreational use. And the State Agency of Agriculture is now has promulgated rules which are waiting to be finalized and approved to define hemp yet further with respect to levels of THC, when you need to harvest it, and what's allowed to be sold in this state versus what's allowed under the 2018 Farm Bill. There are some differences there. So some of what's grown in Vermont will only be able to be sold in Vermont because some of the levels are higher than what the federal hemp bill allows as well. A price I was quoted for CBD flower was $2 to $2.50 per percent CBD per pound, which 2 to 250 if your average plant produces 1 pound, and you can fit 800 to 1,000 plants per acre, maybe 1,200, so let's call it 1,000. And you maybe get a pound per plant, and you maybe get 15%. You're talking about $30,000 an acre, which is still better than vegetables for a gross, but it's not the windfall that I think some people expected. But if you can sell it for wholesale for flour, or certainly retail as flour, you're starting to talk about much bigger numbers. So we grew 500 plants, which consumed about 2/3 of an acre. My plants ended up being particularly robust. They were between 8 and 10, 11 feet tall. So I was more fortunate than most of the folks who tried to grow it in Vermont this year. There's a lot of folks who were jumping in for the gold rush, were in wet soils or got them in late. They didn't get as big. So these are my onion racks that I've repurposed to be hemp drying racks. And it turns out I actually only got about 10% of my hemp onto all these racks when I was drying it. So my drying space needs to be greatly expanded. But the way these were constructed was to add this screening so that airflow could be both underneath the screen and on top of the screen. And I laid one layer of the flour to dry. And to do that, when we brought in the plants, we stripped the flowers off the stalks right that day. They were cut, stripped, then they were run through a flower trimmer machine and then placed on these to dry. And they produced a reasonable product, but it definitely was a little bit bruised up from the process of doing it wet, where I've actually hung about 90% of our cannabis flour to more slowly dry and be a higher quality flour for a higher value use. It's an experiment. We're learning as we go. It's one of the reasons, again, back to starting small. I have some of my field labor time in this. I've got a few days labor harvesting in it, but I don't have an exorbitant amount of investment. Some people had to buy tractors and certain implements to do their fields right. I already owned that from the vegetable operation. So fortunately, my added investment was mostly the human labor time. But I'm pretty sure, I could sell all this for distillate and I would get that back and some more. But if I'm able to sell it as dried flour or value added, then that's when it becomes worthwhile. I've been advocating for both hemp and adult use recreational cannabis to be a legal and regulated product. Vermont, I don't think in any one of these products is ever going to compete on the commodity scale. We're struggling in our dairy. We're going to struggle with anything we try to produce to compete with the bigger states, with the bigger fields, and the bigger machinery, and the bigger capital. But I think Vermont, as always, has had a quality reputation. And if we focus on smaller production, higher quality, niche markets, then I think it could actually be one of the real catalysts towards revitalizing our rural economy. If we had 2,000 to 4,000 plant grows in every town in Vermont, and that employed 6 to 10 people making 50 to 70 grand a year, and you added that many people in every town in rural Vermont, that would really shift the economy and the potential. If then some of that stuff were value added into salves and creams and others, there's more jobs. And the reality, whether it's this product, whether it's other agricultural products, we have the marketplace of 50 million people plus within a one-day drive. And so unlike rural Nebraska and rural Montana and rural Texas, they just don't have the population base relative to the land area that we have within a day drive. So if we do this right, I think it can be one of the things that really helps Vermont stand out from other rural areas in the country.